Okay, thank you everyone for attending and welcome. I am Carol Reimers. I'm president of the League of Women Voters of Connecticut, and I welcome you to what should be a very interesting forum on redistricting and the perils of gerrymandering. So, just to talk a little bit about where the League of Women Voters is on redistricting. Excuse me, I'm getting over a cold, which I think everybody else in the world is as well. So the League believes in apportionment based substantially on population, and political and racial gerrymandering distorts and undermines representative democracy by allowing officials to select their voters rather than voters to elect their officials. When done for purposes of racial discrimination or to ensure the dominance of one political party, gerrymandering runs counter to equal voting rights for all eligible voters. So we in the League promote a transparent and accountable redistricting process, and we would like to end hyper-partisan practices that don't benefit the constituents. We believe responsibility for fair redistricting should be vested in an independent special commission with membership that reflects the diversity of the unit of government. The League works in states across the country to pass ballot initiatives to institute independent redistricting commissions. Across the country, the League has also been acting for fighting for these fair districts. The League of Women Voters versus, I think it's Rusho, is that how it's pronounced? Is the most recent challenge in North Carolina, which the plaintiffs are arguing that the map violates the First and the 14th Amendments and constitutes a partisan gerrymander. The League of Maryland has also submitted an amicus brief before the Supreme Court in Lamone versus Benesek. And the League has had other significant cases in Wisconsin and Michigan. So as you can see, it's a very important issue for our organization. And today, I would like to take a moment to thank Dean Gerken and the Yale Law School and her staff, Jan Conroy, Georgianne Rogers, Mike Thompson, and Nick Cefarelli, who have all made this possible for us. And also special thanks to Elise Lowe from the League of Women Voters of the East Shore, who kept track of all the details for today. And without her help, it would not have happened. And now it is my great pleasure to introduce former State Senator Ed Meyer, who was instrumental in organizing today's forum as well. And Ed is a 1961 graduate of the Yale Law School. He was a federal prosecutor in the Department of Justice and chief prosecutor of the Vito Genovese family of the mafia, appointed by Attorney General Robert Kennedy. Ed was also a New York State Assemblyman from 1971 to 75. More recently, he served as the Connecticut State Senator from 2005 to 2015. The League is proud to say that Ed is also a League member and has been one since 1974, which is the first year that men started joining the League. So he's also a resident of Guilford and married to Patty Ann with 6 children, one of whom is a Connecticut federal judge. So with all this wonderful kudos for Ed, we're happy that he's going to moderate this program for us. Thank you, Ed.
Well, thank you. Is the mic working? Does it sound like it's working? Can you hear me? Good. Thank you, Carol, particularly for the initiative taken by the League in this fascinating and controversial subject. To some of us, district lines is a very personal thing. It's appropriate for you to know why I'm the moderator, why they asked me to be the moderator, because the reasons for that relate very much to the subject of the event today. As Carol mentioned, I was a state legislator in New York, elected in 1970, and the governor was Nelson Rockefeller. And Governor Rockefeller proposed to build a bridge over Long Island Sound from Oyster Bay in Long Island into my district in Westchester County. And from the end of the bridge, he was going to build what he called a Hudson River Expressway, which went up the Hudson River and connected with the New York Thruway. This was a very controversial topic. It was going to be bonded. My constituents and many other constituents were very concerned about it. I formed a coalition of suburban legislators who opposed it, and we were beating the governor on this. We already had two bridges over Long Island Sound, Throgs Neck and Whitestone Bridge. We had a real public transportation problem. So the phone rings, and it's the governor asking to see me. So I met with him, and he said he was very upset with my opposition. He said, don't you know that Robert Moses was his highway czar, Robert Moses and I are connecting Long Island with Canada and uplifting the economy of New York State. And I said, Governor, I think that's the wrong direction. I think we should be going toward public transportation. And he said to me, if you don't stop your opposition, I'm taking your house out of your district. We beat the bridge, we beat the highway, and he took my house out of my district. That was the 1970 census redistricting. It was punishing. It was redistricting used as a punishment. So the second experience was right here in Connecticut. The 2010 census came along, and the Senate president of the time, Don Williams, called me and said, Ed, I got great news for you. I'm a Democrat. He said, I'm taking 2,000 Republican homes out of your district. And I said, where? What town? He said, Durham. Well, Durham is a town of just 6,000 people. And the Republicans and Democratic leadership controlled district lines in Connecticut. And they were putting another senator taking those Republican houses. That senator is the Republican leader here today, Senator Fasano. And the redistricting for 2010 not only was to put 2 state senators into this little town, but it also put 3 state representatives into this little town. And so you had a situation, whereas I was punished and others were punished in New York, in Connecticut, it was all about incumbency, building up incumbents districts, making them less competitive, more one-party, so that we ensured the reelection of incumbents. So Elise Lowe is the distinguished chairman of the Shore chapter of the League of Women Voters. I told her about this, and Elise said, "Why, you've got to organize a panel discussion about this." So that's what happened, and that's why we're here today. We did invite state legislators. Are there any state legislators here? If you raise your hand, I'd like you to recognize. Okay, they're not. We're going to be contacting them after this event today. So there will be a time for question and answers after. The league is putting around cards for you to put any questions you have. We ought to need to have a good give and take on that. And we'll now turn to our very distinguished panel this morning. The first panelist is our great Secretary of the State, Denise Merrill. Secretary Merrill has responsibility for the administration of elections in Connecticut. She was first elected Secretary of the State in 2010, and she was reelected in 2014 and 2018. She's been a reformer. She helped to achieve, for example, Election Day voter registration. She ensured the integrity and security of online registration. Secretary Merrill previously served for 17 years as a state representative and was named by her legislative colleagues as, I'm quoting, most respected by the other side of the aisle. Well done, Denise. Secretary Merrill is an attorney. She graduated from UConn and lives with her family in Hartford. Secretary Merrill.
Good morning. Nice to be here, and thank you to everyone who's put this together. I'm very happy to be back at Yale. I've worked with the Dean Gerken back when she was not the dean on many different issues around election law. That is her expertise, which is very exciting. And I'm one of the founding board members of something called the Women's Campaign School at Yale. And I see my friend Laurel here. We served on the board many years ago. So it's nice to be back. And thank all of you for coming out on this very important issue. So my job today is to talk about this from Connecticut's perspective and to sort of get everybody on the same page, understanding how we do it in Connecticut. Okay, I'll talk closer. There we go. Okay. So first of all, as a chief elections official, I should explain first how Connecticut's elections actually work on the ground. It's very different than any other state, I will say right off the bat. We have no counties in Connecticut. Therefore, the election is run at I would say, a hyper-local level. We have 169 towns. And the towns administer elections and pay for elections. People say I'm in charge of elections. I'm really not. I try to help guide the election process and make sure people are following the law at the local level. We have 2 registrars of voters in each town, 1 from each party. They are elected, not appointed. And then there is a town clerk in every town that also has responsibility for things like absentee ballots, and reporting of results actually come from the clerk's office. So you can see it's a very decentralized and process that's a little bit, frankly, difficult to manage on any level, which is both a blessing and a curse most of the time. I can't imagine the Russians hacking our election system, because there's kind of nothing to hack. We did have attempted incursions into our voter registry, and that was actually confirmed by DHS. So we do have some involvement with computerized things, but largely it's still, we have paper ballots. We have very robust audits after the fact. So that's basically how things work on the ground. So you as a voter, when you come in to vote in Connecticut, you may not realize all of this, but I'm sure if you voted in Connecticut, you know we vote on tabulators that are freestanding. You have a paper ballot. Ballot is kept and audited afterwards, and the results are all published. So we have a very transparent election system. Let's talk about the current redistricting procedure in Connecticut. Connecticut's kind of a mix of things you've heard about at the national level. It is bipartisan, and it is founded in our Constitution in Article 3, Section 6 of the Connecticut Constitution. We are currently just about to go into the decennial census. I am co-chair of a commission that's been put together by the lieutenant governor to make sure that everyone in Connecticut is counted. It's a very big thing. We're very dependent on political representation, among other things, with the census. That census data will be received in 2021 from the federal government. So the new lines will be drawn by a reapportionment committee, which is an 8-member bipartisan committee of legislators with membership designated by the legislative leadership, and that will be formed in February of 2021. The General Assembly must approve the committee's plan with a 2/3 vote in each chamber. That's a large number of votes. Note the number of votes you need to pass the plan. If the General Assembly has not approved a plan by September 15th, 2021, a 9-member redistricting commission is formed. And that routinely is what happens. 8 of the commission's members, like the committee, are designated by the legislative leadership. The 9th member, who must be a Connecticut elector, is chosen by the other 8 members. That commission has until November 30th, 2021 to certify a map by majority vote. The commission's plan does not have to be approved by the General Assembly. If the commission doesn't agree on a plan, the Supreme Court can either compel the commission to complete its work, or the court can draw the districts itself. As you can imagine, there would be a great interest in getting that done yourself rather than having the courts decide the districts. By February 2022, the Supreme Court files its redistricting plan with my office, which will then publish it. So in Connecticut, the only role that I play in all this is that I keep the maps, so to speak, and publish the maps for the public. One of the things I'm going to suggest, and this is just sort of a sidebar to the conversation today, is that currently there is no check back to make sure that the maps are drawn according to the plan at the local level. So what happens is the local registrars are charged with redrawing the maps in their towns. And so they literally sometimes walk the streets to make sure that everyone is appropriately designated in whatever district it is. No one goes back to check to audit, so to speak, those plans. That is a proposal I have this year that my office might take on that role to make sure that the district lines are drawn at the local level in accordance with the map that finally comes out of this long process. So that's really the only role. Other states' secretaries have greater or lesser roles in some cases. So I just wanted to point that out. So as a brief background to the whole issue, I'm sure most of you have heard about one person, one vote. Well, that is the seminal case, was Reynolds versus Sims in 1964. It's the seminal one person, one vote case, and it held that the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment requires substantially equal representation. That's the words they used. Smaller than a 10% deviation among state legislative districts is reasonably safe from being overturned. In other words, at the federal level, you can deviate from that one man, one vote requirement by up to 10%, no more. And that's important when you start thinking about how you draw these lines and how you make sure you're abiding by the most important provision that we're all trying to abide by, and that's the one person, one vote. No deviance, though, is safe from challenge. And so there are, as you can imagine, other factors that come into play besides just the fact that we're trying to ensure an equal representation for every human being, so to speak. For example, the Voting Rights Act comes into play in some limited circumstances where racial minorities might have the ability to elect representatives of their choice, for example. That might entertain a larger deviation in that interest. So I just, one little historic note. Connecticut was one of the worst cases of unbalanced legislative districts historically before the 1964 case. In 1950, 25% of Connecticut's population, Hartford, Bridgeport, and New Haven, was represented by only 6 representatives, less than 3% of the total number of representatives. The famous example I always think of is the fact that Union, Connecticut had the same number of representatives as Hartford in the 1800s. So we had a long way to go there initially to fulfill the requirements of the new one person, one vote requirement. And again, I think it goes back to the fact that we have just lots of small towns in Connecticut, and home rule is jealously guarded, and it does come into play when you start trying to redistrict these maps, especially with state representative districts, which are much smaller. So you can see that mathematically, it's very difficult to make sure that every town only has one representative. There's a concept called nesting, where when you're trying to do what Ed is suggesting, in other words, have not only contiguous districts, but also districts that kind of lines that match up with each other, even as state representative and state senatorial districts, it becomes very, very difficult to honor those town lines depending on the size of the towns. And so I think there is a great effort made to honor those town lines, which from an administrator's point of view would be very much welcome, because people in Connecticut, at least, relate to their towns. That's the kind of relationship you're building on here. And when you start splitting towns, even by state rep district, of course, you result in a lot of voter confusion, among other problems. As an administrator of elections, I can tell you, trying to get ballots straightened out in these towns. Ed gave you the example of Durham, which I think now has, we couldn't remember if it has 3 or 4 different ballots. But I think of the example of Torrington, Connecticut, which is a city of 30,000 maybe. They have 8 ballots because they got split congressionally, 3 state rep seats and 2 senatorial seats, and none of them match up. So you end up with lots of ballots, and sometimes that results in problems like we saw this year in Stratford, where, poll workers, they all have to manage all this, and they do this once a year, and they're volunteers in some cases. So you get situations where they get the ballots mixed up, or towns have to find 8 different polling places, which is usually impossible. So they end up putting more than one precinct and more than one ballot in one room. And so you can see that from an administrative point of view, it's very difficult. On the other hand, I can't imagine how you're going to balance all these interests and still honor all the town lines. And I sat down with one of the people that does the actual mapping for the House districts, and he demonstrated to me very, very clearly that it's impossible, literally, to draw lines without separating some towns. So just to be clear, mathematically, you can't do all these things at once. Elections is a classic example in the law of balancing of all kinds of different interests, perhaps more than usual, actually. So what are we trying to balance here? Well, we're clearly trying to balance the one person, one vote. But in the Connecticut Constitution, there is a nod in the Connecticut Constitution to preserving town integrity, as we've just been discussing. And also, they must be contiguous. So they must touch each other. There are other factors used by the courts, and a lot of this, it's a kind of a mix of court-made law and statutory law and constitutional law. So other things can be taken into consideration when these lines are challenged. For example, what they call compactness. Are they like tightly drawn? Competitiveness, as we've been discussing, have they been drawn with an eye toward making competitive districts? That's literally something we're trying to achieve, because voters know instinctively when there are districts that are not competitive. And that's when you see low voter turnout, because they get it. Voters understand when there's just no chance of this other person winning. And so that is a consideration in a lot of the court cases. And there is a nod in the court cases also to preserving the core of previous districts. That means we're going to try to keep districts the same as much as possible. Why would you want to do that? Voter confusion. People get very confused if they're told every 10 years that they're voting in a different place, in a different district, for different people. So there really is a need to keep this as constant as possible. And there is an attempt to keep communities together. In other words, in Connecticut, I would argue that's probably towns, but also communities of interest, such as minority groups, or, people relate differently across rivers. Boundaries don't have to be streets. In some cases, they're rivers. In some cases, they're highways. So wherever you're keeping a community of interest together, we had a very interesting situation with the University of Hartford. I think it was 2010, where the University of Hartford the line cut right through the university, but it turned out that 4 of the dorms were in Hartford and 1 was in West Hartford. And so I don't know if that one went to court. I think they worked it out, but that obviously splits a community of interest. So those sorts of things have to be considered. Well, when you put this all together, you see we're trying to make a very complicated mathematical formulation of how to honor all these different things. We're trying to balance a lot here. So I guess I would just stop here by saying, consider the following. Balancing act, first of all. You're balancing a lot of different interests here. And then, of course, I haven't talked about this too much, but of course the idea of whether or not this should be or is a politically motivated system. I would just say, from my point of view, and this is my opinion, no system is without politics. I don't see a way that you could entirely remove politics from any way that you choose the people who are going to be doing this. That being said, I think Connecticut's somewhere in the middle of the pack, in the sense that it is not what you've heard in some other places, which are dreadfully partisan, honestly. Places like Wisconsin, North Carolina, where you've seen when there's a majority, either Republican or Democrat, I suspect. I haven't looked back at it. They don't even let the other party in the room. And then they create the districts in a totally partisan way. Connecticut is certainly not that. We are a bipartisan redistricting situation. And I would argue it has largely led to pretty fair outcomes. You also have to look at the outcomes here. So, and we could get in a long discussion of some examples of that, but wherever you land in that debate about the fairness, the partisanship involved, I would say that we're certainly not the most partisan system. And I would urge everyone to think about the outcomes you want and how we are able to manage the balancing act that we're doing with all this. I'll stop there, Ed. Thank you.
Thank you, Secretary. Our next panelist is the distinguished Dean of Yale Law School, Heather Gerken. She's also the gracious host of this event today. And we thank you so much, Dean, for all you've done and your staff. Dean Gerken is one of the country's leading experts on election law. She's published very widely on it. She's also very involved with the whole concept of federalism. She's been named one of our country's best law teachers, and the New York Times has hailed her, the words are, an intellectual guru. After getting her bachelor's degree from Princeton and her law degree from the University of Michigan, she clerked for David Souter in the United States Supreme Court, followed by a professorship at Harvard Law School. She must be very happy to be out of there. Dean Gerken is married to David Simon, who teaches political science at Yale and specializes in African politics. Dean Gerken, you're next.
Thank you very much for having me. Thanks to the League for putting on this panel. Really delighted to have you inside of our walls. One of my goals as Dean has been to open up this beautiful jewel box to the community, and this is a wonderful opportunity to do so. I should just note about the intellectual guru piece, just take that with a grain of salt. The morning that the Sunday New York Times arrived at my door, I was having trouble figuring out how to put the crumb tray into my new toaster. So I just want to baseline this. I thought I would, I'm really here speaking not as Dean of Yale Law School, which a job I've had for about 18 months, but as a scholar of election law, which I've done for 18 years. And I thought I would talk to you a little bit about how scholars think about this problem and note two things. One is, why are scholars worried about gerrymandering? And two, how did we get here and why hasn't the Supreme Court fixed this problem? So I'll start just with what scholars worry about. Scholars worry a lot about a phrase that they use called the foxes guarding the henhouse, which is the worry that legislators are choosing their constituents before constituents are choosing legislators. No one is an angel. It's very hard not to be self-interested in doing so. And so it's useful to keep in mind there's two kinds of gerrymanders that scholars write about, and there's a near universal consensus that these are not good things. The first kind of gerrymander is the kind that we see happening in some other states. That's a partisan gerrymander. It is the most vicious form of partisan politics you will see. You will often see a state that is roughly 50-50 in terms of its voters, but one party having 2/3 of the seats safe, no matter what happens. So it means that no matter what the voters do to change their mind, it's going to be very hard for them to be able to switch one party out. I actually teach election law in this classroom, so I often have my students indulge in vicious gerrymandering. And so I have them imagine this room is divided 50-50, Republicans and Democrats. What would you do if you wanted to hurt the other side and help yours? And it turns out to be incredibly easy to do one of two things. So the districting involves two mean things, other than drawing people's house outside their district. One is called packing. So that means you take a bunch of voters in the party that you oppose and you put them all in one district. So you imagine this is, a 50-50. Imagine there's one district that's 100% Republican, right? And then they crack, that's the second phrase, they spread the Republicans out in other districts so they're ineffective. And so you could easily imagine 4 districts have a 3/4 Democratic or Republican, pick your party, margin. And that's one form of gerrymandering that people worry about a lot. And that's the form of gerrymandering that is currently in front of the Supreme Court. The other form of gerrymandering that scholars worry about is bipartisan gerrymandering. Bipartisan gerrymandering will typically reproduce the political outcome that you see within the state because it's just going to reflect the balance of the legislators before. The worry about bipartisan gerrymandering is, again, it's about the foxes in the henhouse. The worry is the one thing that Democrats and Republican legislators typically can agree on is that it would be really nice if we all came back next year. And so what they do is they draw themselves very, very safe seats that are almost impossible to lose. That may not actually mean that the state doesn't shift with voter preference, but it often does mean that voters within their own districts have trouble changing their minds about who they want to represent them. So those are the two kinds of problems that scholars worry about. And you may wonder, so why hasn't the Supreme Court done something about this? I think we're accustomed to the United Supreme Court ruling on a lot of election cases, Bush v. Gore, campaign finance, Citizens United. I'm sure you're all familiar with those. And so I thought I'd just tell you a little story about how we got here. And the story begins actually with the districts that Secretary Merrill was describing, these rural-urban disparities. So why did those exist in the 1950s? They existed because state legislators, as populations moved from rural areas into cities, they became radically disproportionate to the number of people in each district. So you'd have one district with an enormous number of people and one district with almost no one in it, each having one vote in the legislature. And the Supreme Court waited and waited and waited for the legislators to fix that problem. And you won't be surprised to learn that the one thing the legislators at that time could agree on is that everyone should come back next year. Had they done any redistricting, they would have shifted power from rural to urban districts. And since they all represented many rural districts, they didn't want to do that. That is the core of the foxes guarding the henhouse. For decades, the Supreme Court refused to intervene. It refused to go into what Justice Frankfurter famously called the political thicket. He warned everyone, don't enter the political thicket. Courts don't belong there. But eventually the Supreme Court did enter the political thicket and ultimately created the one person, one vote standard, which caused a massive shift in the power distribution in this country because so many states were in this situation. Now, once the court was a little bit inside the political thicket with one person, one vote, you won't be surprised to learn that lawyers found many ways to invite them in a little further. And over time, the Supreme Court has taken on an increasingly muscular and interventionist mode in politics, one that had previously avoided. So we see the Supreme Court regularly ruling in cases involving campaign finance. We see the Supreme Court regularly getting involved in cases that Secretary Merrill has to deal with in election administration. We see it doing it in party regulation and so on. But the one part of the thicket, maybe the darkest, thickest part of the thicket, is partisan gerrymandering. And for reasons that I want to just give you a sense of, the Supreme Court has never gone that far. It's been very nervous about going into the political thicket and regulating partisan gerrymandering. So other forms of gerrymandering, one person, one vote, racial gerrymandering, which is designed to create certain kinds of districts that are on racial grounds, that it's regulated. But it's always stopped with partisan gerrymandering. And you may wonder, well, why is that? And I'll say, I think there are many reasons, but let me just give you two. First, the Supreme Court worries a lot about calling winners and losers because it wants to be a nonpartisan institution. It wants to have legitimacy in the eyes of the American people. And when you rule in a redistricting case, you are calling winners and losers. No matter what, you're choosing who's going to win and who's going to lose in a given redistricting cycle. And so the court's very nervous about doing that. The second and related reason that the court is nervous about it doesn't quite know what the standard should be. So if you're going to make decisions about winners and losers, you want to have a standard that you feel confident in, that judges feel like they can implement in a basis that's not purely partisan. So if the standard's really mushy, the danger is that judges' own political preference will just seep into the decision. So the Supreme Court has been looking for something that they would call a manageable standard, one that does not allow for judges' political preferences to shape everything, one that looks from the outside like the kind of thing that judges do. And we have spent decades in conversation with the Supreme Court, both election lawyers and scholars, in trying to think about those two problems. I will say last year, many people thought that the Supreme Court might actually plunge all the way into the political thicket in a case called Whitford. And in that case, a series of briefs were sent to the Supreme Court urging it to take that final step and to start to regulate partisan gerrymandering. And a number of political scientists essentially proposed what they thought to be a manageable standard, which is called partisan symmetry. That's a very fancy word for the simplest of concepts. From second grade, I cut, you choose. Turning the tables, all that partisan symmetry does is it means that, look, if you look at this map and figure out how well it treats Democrats, just imagine everyone switched their vote. How well would it treat Republicans? Because the idea was, if you're doing a lot of packing and cracking, it's going to favor one party versus the other. It'll waste more votes for one party versus the other. So partisan symmetry is a very simple idea, which is that you should treat both sides fairly when you're engaged in redistricting. This was up front of the Supreme Court. There were amicus brief galore, and once again, the Supreme Court ducked the question. On standing grounds are just means who's entitled to bring the claim, who's actually been injured. So we're up again this year with two different cases, one in Maryland, one in North Carolina. Both of those cases involve the kind of partisan gerrymandering I was describing, one side really trying to damage the other, using the power that it holds in redistricting. And there are an enormous range of standards that are being put in front of the court, some First Amendment standards, some equal protection standards. I mean, I'm delighted there's an Article 1, which is only if you're a con law geek would that make you happy, but it does make me inordinately happy just to know that someone's using Article 1 in a fashion that's not been used before. But there's a lot of questions in front of the court. Basically, the lawyers have kind of thrown everything at the court in the hope that it will pick up one of these standards and regulate partisan gerrymandering. So Tom Wolfe is the country's leading expert on these, so I'm going to let him dig into the cases. But I just wanted to sort of set the table and remind you both why it is that academics worry about gerrymandering, and also how it is that we got to where we are and why the court hasn't gone farther. So I'm really looking forward to the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dean Gerken. Our next panelist is the distinguished president of the Connecticut Senate, Martin Looney. Senator Looney previously served as a state senator, and before that, as a state representative beginning in 1981. He became president of the Connecticut State Senate in 2015. Senator Looney is a very accomplished legislator, as I personally well know because I sat right next to him in the Senate chamber for 10 years. I doubt that there's any state senator in the United States who has received more awards and recognition than Senator Looney. He is special. He is also a practicing attorney and has taught in the criminal justice program at the University of New Haven and the political science department at Quinnipiac. Senator Looney lives here in New Haven with his gracious wife, Ellen. Senator Looney.
Thank you so much, Senator Meyer. We still miss you in Hartford, and he was the only person I think that has ever served in the Connecticut legislature that we know about had prior experience serving in the General Assembly in another state. And he would often point out to us that we were far too tolerant of letting the Republicans speak for a longer period of time in our debates than they allowed in New York. But I would say the first thing in Connecticut is that what happened to Senator Meyer in New York could not happen in Connecticut because the governor of Connecticut has no role in the redistricting or legislative process at all. In many states, redistricting plans pass like a regular bill passed by the General Assembly and subject to the governor's veto. That's not the case here. What we have is a joint resolution that has to pass both chambers by a 2/3 margin. And that's another protection against one party trying to ram through a plan that is highly partisan. That is pretty much prevented by the fact of the need for a 2/3 vote of the plan adopted by the General Assembly. As both Senator Fasano and I were members of the last Redistricting Commission in 2011, I was the majority leader at that time, and Don Williams was our Senate president, and Senator Fasano was the deputy Republican leader, and Senator John McKinney was the Republican leader at the time, but we were both on it. And the committee or the commission consisted of 8 legislative leaders, 4 Democrats, 4 Republicans, and that is our system, regardless of who holds the partisan majority in the General Assembly at a given time. So it is a balanced bipartisan commission, which then selects, if necessary to break ties, a 9th member. The 9th member who was selected back then was a former Democratic legislator who became a state auditor. For the previous 3 times before that, in 81, 91, and 2001, the 9th member was a former Republican Speaker of the House of Representatives. So that has been our process. One of the things I think to keep in mind, as the Secretary said, is that the modern legislature in Connecticut really only dates from 1967, because prior to that, we did have one of the most outrageously imbalanced systems in the nation, because prior to Baker versus Carr, the 1962 case that mandated the one-person, one-vote rule, when the Supreme Court finally engaged and said that it would no longer keep the whole system at arm's length because of the political question doctrine. And that decision addressed a particular problem. Connecticut had a system where, at that time, there were 290 members of the House of Representatives, but there were only 36 senators, same number we have now. So the principle was that each of the 169 towns was guaranteed 1 representative, regardless of population. If a town had above a certain population, it got a 2nd representative. So each town had at least 1. No town had more than 2. The Senate was really actually balanced in a way that was more favorable to urban areas. So it was a very strange thing that prior to 1967, New Haven had 4 state senators, but only 2 state reps. In the 1967 General Assembly, after the first redistricting plan went into effect, New Haven then had 2 state senators and 8 state reps. In fact, a couple of former state senators became reps at that time. So that original plan resulted in 177 House districts. It was changed in 1971 to reduce to our current number of 151 in the House, with 36 in the Senate. And we do have a system, I believe, that does prevent partisan advantage. And I think also the fact that we haven't been able to lock in guaranteed majorities, because if you look at the last 2 elections, the Republicans made substantial gains in 2016. Democrats made substantial gains in 2018 with lines that were the same in both cases. So I think we have not had the kind of the extreme partisan drawing of lines and the sort of cherry picking of populations to load them up in one district so that the other districts would be safe for other parties. But it is something now we will be going into again in 2021. So we have one more election based upon the current lines, the 2020 election. One of the challenges that we have had is in looking at how other states do things. We do believe that we have a system which is quite balanced and fair, and looks at broad-based community needs. We do look at factors like the Secretary of State mentioned about what are natural communities of interest, what are natural boundaries between districts. At the same time, we do have to recognize that we are bound by strict population rules, that the Supreme Court does not give much leeway in terms of the variance from the actual number that each district should have. But we try to be sensitive to those concerns to the extent that we possibly can. In terms of town lines, it is inevitable that there be some crossing of lines and dividing of lines, because we are one of the states that does not have an equal division of House districts into Senate districts, as some states do. Some have 3 or 4 or House districts per Senate districts. Ours are a little off. We have 136 rather 36 state senators, 151 representatives. So it's a little more than 4. So some senators have actually 4. Some may have more than 4 actual representatives living in their district, depending on where the House lines cut in regard to the Senate lines. One thing also to keep in mind, and Senator Fasano can speak more about this when he addresses you, is that in the process in 2011, the Senate members worked together on drawing the Senate lines. We had no input at all into the drawing of the House lines. The House members worked exclusively on the drawing of the House lines. They had no input at all into the Senate lines. So when we'd have House members coming up to us sometimes saying, "How's it going?" we'd always have to say, ask the Speaker, ask the Minority Leader. We're not involved in that at all. It was only after we had agreed upon a map for the Senate lines and a map for the House lines, which that we then jointly, the 8 of us together, addressed the congressional lines. And there was controversy over the congressional lines, and the 9th member was called in to vote on the congressional lines, and there was a court challenge over the congressional lines, but the lines that were drawn by the commission were upheld. So I believe that our system has worked quite well, especially if you look at some of the ways that other states work, not only those that have wholly partisan drawing of lines, and obviously there are a number of states, whoever is the majority at a given time gets to draw the lines regardless. And also in other states, other statewide elected officials are heavily involved. In some cases, as Secretary Merrill said, the Secretary of State is part of a panel that may draw up the lines. The lieutenant governor, in some cases, may be a voting or non-voting member. In some cases, the governor appoints members to a commission. In some cases, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court is involved in the process, or the State Attorney General. So in some cases, even if it is a commission, it can be structured in a way that winds up being wholly partisan if all of those designated positions are held by members of the same party. So that is something that we are free from in Connecticut as well. I wanted to just read briefly a couple of the things that the way commissions have been adapted. So in a few states that have commissions with primary responsibility for drawing a plan for legislative districts, if we look at the state of Colorado as an independent legislative redistricting commission, here's how it's organized. A panel of 3 retired justices or judges from the Colorado Supreme Court or the Colorado Court of Appeals of differing party affiliation will randomly select by lot 300 applicants from amongst all applicants who met the qualification requirements from each of the 2 largest political parties, and 450 who are not affiliated with any political party. From these pools, the panel will select 50 from each pool based on their merit, however you determine merit. From these pools, the panel will choose by lot 2 commissioners from each of the largest 2 parties and 2 who are unaffiliated. The majority and minority leaders of the House and Senate each select a pool of 10 candidates from all qualified applicants who are associated with the 2 largest political parties. The panel of judges selects 1 commissioner from each legislative leaders pool and 2 commissioners from the pool of unaffiliated applicants selected earlier. Geographic distribution based on congressional districts and a final selection of 4 commissioners from each of the 2 largest parties and 4 unaffiliated commissioners is required. After that, they look into the entrails of birds that used to be done in during Roman times to try to determine victory. Same thing, the Michigan Commission, if you can follow that, called the Independent Citizens Redistricting Commission. The Secretary of State there, this could be in store for you, Madam Secretary, makes applications to become a commissioner available to the public, including mailing to 10,000 Michigan residents at random. The Secretary would then randomly select 60 applicants from each pool affiliating with the 2 major parties and 80 from the pool of those who were unaffiliated. These pools would be submitted to the Senate majority and minority leaders, the Speaker of the House and the House minority leader, and each legislative leader is allowed to strike 5 applicants from any pool or pools. The Secretary would then randomly draw the names of 4 applicants from the pools affiliated with the 2 major parties and 5 from the unaffiliated pool. I prefer our system. So I will stop at that point and look forward to the later question and answer discussion. But if you are asking questions, I'd ask you to speak up. I've had a bad cold for a week and a half, and it sounds like I'm underwater when I'm listening to other people speak because of the sinus infection.
just want to tell you Yankee fans here that Senator Looney is an avid Red Sox fan. Our next real expert on this subject is Tom Wolfe. Tom Wolfe is counsel to the Democracy Program of the Brennan Center for Justice located at NYU Law School. He focuses there on issues relating to redistricting and the census, and has appeared before the United States Supreme Court many times, often as an amicus curiae. Mr. Wolfe's articles and op-eds dealing with gerrymandering have appeared in many major newspapers throughout the country, and his views are frequently expressed on TV and radio and in forums just like this. Thomas Wolfe received his bachelor's degree from Harvard, his law degree from Yale here, and was awarded the prestigious Marshall Scholar. He clerked for our own Guido Calabresi in the Second Circuit. Tom Wolfe.
Thanks for having me. I actually learned everything I know about election law from Dean Gerken. So I think I think our intellectual guru status is still intact, assuming that anything I say here is convincing or interesting to you. If not, then maybe we should discount it again. Can everyone hear me? Yes. All right, excellent. So we left off a little bit earlier talking about the Supreme Court's piece in this. I've been down in DC kind of getting ready for those arguments. I'm not participating in the arguments, but I'm cautiously optimistic that the court will do something here. But the important thing is that if the court rules in favor of the plaintiffs in any of these cases, that ruling is likely to be very narrow. It's likely only to focus on the most heinous abuses of the system and likely won't reach things that are kind of more run-of-the-mill. So what does that mean for you? What it means is the Supreme Court will not save you. To the extent that you think that there are things that are wrong with redistricting processes around the country, the Supreme Court can set some helpful guardrails on the outside of the process, but it's not going to fix everything. And this relates back to what Dean Gerken was saying about the political thicket problem. One of the other concerns that the court has is having to get involved in too many cases. This is a little bit of an appellate nerd thing, but unlike most other cases in the federal courts that first go in front of a trial court, then go to an appellate judge, then go to the Supreme Court, redistricting challenges to statewide maps get heard in front of 3 judges at trial, and then they go immediately to the Supreme Court. So the court's really worried that if it creates a cause of action and lets too many people sue, it's just going to end up spending all of its time dealing with partisan gerrymandering cases, and that doesn't want to. They don't want to do that. So things have to be relatively narrow. So there are other routes to change. One of the ways of changing the redistricting process that's gaining a lot of momentum right now is the Independent Redistricting Commission. My colleagues and I at the center have been studying and advising on independent commissions for years, and we're confident that well-designed commissions, and the big emphasis on well-designed there, can do a lot to get us out of the redistricting tangle that we're in states across the country. But instead of talking about any particular commission, because this is kind of another important theme for me, it's not a one-size-fits-all kind of thing. What you need to really understand more than what happens in California or what happens in Michigan is why you might want to move to a system that looks more like that rather than one that you may currently have. So what I'm going to try to do is share a little bit about my understanding of the values that underlie our advocacy for independent redistricting commissions. That will give you an opportunity, likely over the upcoming few years, to evaluate the reforms that are being put on the table, evaluate the system that currently exists, and then think hard and in an informed way about whether you want to move one way or another. Generally speaking, I kind of wear 2 hats. One is as a lawyer, and the other is kind of like a legal policy advisor. Today, I'm mainly speaking as a legal policy advisor. But as a few of the speakers I think have already kind of laid out for you, around the country, there are a couple of major different ways that maps are redrawn currently. The dominant model is state legislatures. And here, what we're really talking about is maps just being treated like they're any other kind of legislation. Through some apparatus or another, The maps get created, they get voted on, they get passed like they're bills like any other bills. Usually the maps have to get passed by both chambers of the legislature. Most of the time the governor has a veto, although in some states under certain circumstances the governor does not. One of the reasons why North Carolina has the particular problems that it has right now that they've brought up to the Supreme Court is the governor doesn't have a veto. So that gave, back in 2011, the Republican Party, which kind of benefited from the Tea Party wave, to max out their seats, lock them in, and there was no way for the rival party to even have any say over it, and there was no way for the governor, if the governor had been a Democrat at the time, to block the map. The second way of drawing them are what are called advisory commissions. Advisory commissions sometimes consist of legislators, sometimes they are non-legislators, sometimes it's a mix of both, but the general concept is that the members of the commission create a map, they recommend the map to the legislature, then the legislature has the final say in approving the maps, and usually it's an up or down vote. There's not latitude to alter the map. As folks have already told you, Connecticut follows this model in the first instance, and it requires a 2/3 majority of both houses to pass the map. Then you have independent commissions. Independent commissions have a lot of different forms. The basic concept here, though, is that the commissioners, the people who are in charge of drawing the maps, are neither current lawmakers or elected officials of any kind. And the way they get on to the commission is that they're appointed by an independent entity that is also not stocked with people who have political connections. The independent entity receives applications, it screens candidates on the basis of various qualitative factors and also to remove conflicts. The commission makes the map, and then the map the commission comes up with is the map that the state uses. The leading example of this right now is California. Arizona has also been doing this, and then there have been reforms that were passed in 2018 that will institute this process for the upcoming round of redistricting, including in Michigan. You have what are called political appointee commissions, and the way these commissions work is you have individuals who are directly appointed by elected officials, party leaderships, or political party committees. The reason why they are not independent commissions is because all of the people get on to the committee through the partisan political process. In some states, the way this commission is created is that there's kind of equal seats for members of each party. Sometimes one party has more seats than the other, depending on how they've been performing in the state up to that point. Then we've got politician commissions, which are comprised entirely of incumbent lawmakers or other elected officials, and they're usually appointed by the legislative or party leadership. Then we have backup commissions. Backup commissions are basically called in to draw maps whenever the initial process that's set out doesn't work. You may have noticed in the way we've been talking about Connecticut thus far is that Connecticut's advisory commission is basically a politician commission. The backup commission is basically a political appointee commission. That's hopefully the driest part of this presentation. Okay, so that's the kind of landscape. That's the nuts and bolts, generally speaking, of how people put these maps together. There are a lot of problems with these processes. Some of the problems have to do with the way the maps perform, and that's really what the Supreme Court's been concerned about. What does this map mean for when Republicans and Democrats cast their ballots, who ultimately ends up taking seats? They've also had concerns about the effects that drawing these lines have on the ability of minority voters, either in the case of the Voting Rights Act to elect candidates of their choice, or in racial gerrymandering circumstances, whether they've been sorted in and out of districts as a result of their race. But there are other problems too that don't really have to do with the way the maps perform, that have to do with the way the maps are put together. Sometimes these two things travel together, where bad process gets you bad maps. So you have these systems that are extremely secret. They happen in off-site locations and locked rooms that most people don't have access to. A lot of times the mapping process, even if it's part of the legislature, is basically just run by one consultant who's on the payroll of one party or the other. And whatever party is paying that consultant generally ends up getting an advantage in seats. That's what happened in North Carolina. It's basically also what happened in Maryland. No surprise, both of those maps, one tremendously favors Republicans, the other tremendously favors Democrats, and both of them are in front of the Supreme Court right now. Frequently, we'll have no public participation in the hearings, or if there are hearings, they're sham hearings, meaning that people take time out of their day to provide testimony about what would make these maps good, and then the politicians or their consultants who are in charge of the process just ignore everything that everyone said and they draw the maps anyway. Sometimes the maps are drawn before the hearings are even held. You may have an irregular legislative process where everything's sped up. It's secret, there's no participation from anyone in the other party, and frequently there's no participation from the rank and file. So in the Wisconsin case that we saw last year, it benefited Republicans, but basically the Republican Party leadership created the maps. They didn't let the Democrats look at them at all, and they called the Republican rank and file into their office and they said, here's your district. All right, now go away. It wasn't even really about individual legislators. It was all about cementing the power of one party as the party leadership understood it. There's also outside money that gets poured into these processes. And another thing that I think is maybe overlooked is these processes are obviously important. Anyone who tells you that they're not, I would be suspicious of. There's no reason to spend all this time and money creating these maps if the way you draw the lines doesn't really matter. And as it turns out, when you can get a lot of an advantage from the map drawing process, there's a lot of incentive to get involved early and turn it into a fight. And then we elect our legislators to legislate for us. They spend a lot of time fighting over the way the lines should look. They start to hate each other. And then when it comes time to actually do the job of governing, they're just at each other's throats and it's impossible for them to cooperate to get anything done. It's definitely a tail wagging the dog kind of situation. So what could you do about this? Again, there are models of things like independent redistricting commissions that are out there. But I think it's better to focus on the principles and the values at stake. Why would you want to change these things? At the Brennan Center, at one level, we know what we're against. We're against disadvantaging any group of people on the basis of their race or their party. We're against extreme maps where one party or one interest group gets to control the whole process and decide how it runs. We're also against secretive and exclusive redistricting processes that don't give voters an opportunity to actually participate in determining what the map should look like. So if you take those things out of the equation, what do you put in? Here's what we value. Independence in the redistricting process, particularly independence from political parties. We value clear rules for drawing the maps. We value racial equity in the map drawing process, rules to promote compromise, and rules that promote transparency and public participation. Now, independence can resolve a lot of the issues that we see in maps around the country, but if we can't get independence, and independence isn't always politically possible, or sometimes it's not legally possible, there are other things that you can do to kind of constrain the ability of map makers to run the process to their own advantage. So this is important. Again, while we've studied independent commissions and we think that they provide a route forward, we always think that you need to take the political feasibility of the issue into account and the legal feasibility into account. Independence can get you a lot of things, but it doesn't necessarily need to be the be-all, end-all. So what would your rules look like? One, ranking. So it almost doesn't matter what your rules are, but you should rank them. Because if you rank them, put some guardrails again on how people can draw the maps. Two, you've got complying with federal law, and a few of the panelists have already spoken about this. One person, one vote, rules against racial gerrymandering, Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. Achieving racial equity can be a key rule in any kind of reform. Keeping communities of interest together, and in a state like Connecticut, communities of interest may very well be towns. Then there are other geographic constraints like contiguity that I think are a little less important, but they're kind of rote elements of all these processes. How would you apply these values to commissions? So again, there are many ways to do this. They can be more detailed or less detailed. One state's model may work for you, another state's model may not. California may work, Michigan may not. It's all sort of trying things on and seeing what fits. But generally speaking, the content counts and the design counts. So if you want to create an independent commission, you do have to take the details seriously. What would you want? Well, for starters, if you could get it, an independent selection process. And that means that you're both filtering the people that become commissioners for conflicts of interest, because remember, that's the main reason why we want to take this out of party hands in the first place, so that the foxes aren't guarding the henhouse anymore. I guess it's the hens are guarding the henhouse. There's no need to guard the henhouse. You also can qualitatively assess the candidates. So if you're worried about totally random people from around the state of Connecticut getting put onto these commissions, you can actually set forward criteria that are created by people who know more about the subject to make sure that you have a good mix of people who have the relevant skills. So one of the reasons why the California Commission was very successful was that they actually ended up having a mix of people who were just, generally publicly spirited people who wanted to participate in the commission, and folks who had experience in government in the past, including both federal and state government. Our studies suggest that independence is basically the #1 criteria for making good maps. And when I say that, I can put a little more meat on that. One has to do with the way they perform. So you get maps that are more representative of the people in the state as their interests shape up, but also people perceive the process as being more legitimate. They don't view it as part of like a shady political deal. They see it as a transparent, publicly informed process, and it makes them more willing to accept the ultimate results, even if the ultimate results may not always be exactly what people would like, in an ideal world. The second thing past independence that you'd be looking for are clear prioritized criteria for map drawing. And clarity and priority can often be more important than the substance, because again, what we're looking for are structures that can be put into place to make the maps that come out of the process make sense to people and fulfill the kind of values that we want to see manifested in our maps. The size matters. Between 9 and 15 members is kind of the rule of thumb here. Why? Basically, what you're trying to do is 3 things. You want to create a commission that reflects the diversity of the population of the state. You want to eliminate the potential for deadlock, and you want to encourage cooperation. As the group gets bigger up to a certain point, it's easier to fulfill all those different objectives. You want rules that promote negotiation and compromise. So what's good and what's bad? A good example of this would be a process that requires members from each group that's represented on the commission to have to approve the map. So for instance, California has some Democrats, some Republicans, and some independents. You can't pass a map unless you get votes from people in each of those buckets. It's not possible for the Democrats and the independents to pair together and cut out the Republicans, or the Republicans and Democrats to pair together and box out the independents. Tiebreaker models are generally not great, where you have 4 on one side, 4 on the other, and 1 person in the middle. It basically just creates an incentive for one side or the other to lobby the tiebreaker, and then whoever captures the tiebreaker wins the game. Transparency is another key aspect here. It helps keep abuses in check, but it also helps the people that are supposed to be represented by these maps make it clear what kind of interests they have that they want to see represented in the maps. It could be people who all send their kids to the same schools, people who use the same highways to commute to work. It doesn't just have to be parties. It doesn't just have to be racial or ethnic groups or language groups. There are any number of different ways that these things can come together. 2 other seemingly minor points, but very important points. If you're going to create a commission, it's good to make sure that there are legal provisions to make sure that it's adequately funded, because you can set up this whole process, but if they don't have money to do the work, then it's like, why bother? And then sufficient time to do the job. So the census numbers come down at the end of 2020, after the census is conducted, and then you need to get the maps in place so people can start running. So you need enough time to set the commission up, solicit all the applications, figure out who's going to be part of the commission, then let them actually develop maps. Those are kind of my general rules of thumb. Again, it's not a one-size-fits-all kind of thing. I think the most important thing is to think hard about how your maps currently function and whether they're falling short, and what other kinds of values you'd like to see represented, and then start working from there. There are these models out there, but the most important thing is to make sure that the thing you create is serving the ultimate goals that you intended to serve. That's all I got.
Thank you, Tom. Our cleanup hitter in the panel today is Senator Len Fasano. Senator Fasano is the Republican leader of the Connecticut Senate and has been in that role since 2014. He was first elected to the Senate in 2003, and he's a very strong advocate of bipartisan policies and bipartisan approaches in the state legislature. When the legislature is not in session, Senator Fasano has an active law practice here in New Haven, and he's senior partner of his law firm. He received his bachelor's degree from Yale, where he was a running back on the football team, and his law degree from Quinnipiac and a master's degree in law from Boston University. Senator Fasano lives in North Haven with his family. Senator Fasano.
Thank you very much. And in true bipartisan spirit, I'm fighting a cold, just like Senator Looney. Ed had asked if any legislators are here. I wanted to recognize that Josh Elliott, representative from Hamden, is here. So thank you for coming. Oh, representative. Oh, a whole bunch of here. Okay, well, thank you.
Yeah, I think my large head is probably blocking
Yes,
you from being able to
it's
see the
back
people
there
here.
too. I just wanted to say that now that you go last, there isn't a lot to add because everyone has said everything about everything. And I know we want to get some questions in. But doing the redistricting is a very complicated mechanism, as you're hearing, and we have to have certain criteria. And when you're dealing with 169 towns, all of which, not all of which, but some of which are very, very small, you end up having to make choices of cutting towns into different districts. I will say when Senator Meyer talked about the fact that Durham got cut, it was a result of like a balloon type of a thing. Hamden District, which was Senator Crisco at the time, had lost population, which pushed into Senator Looney's part of Hamden, which pushed Senator Looney into part of North Haven, which pushed me into Durham. And the way that kind of worked was trying to figure out the one vote issue and keeping the parameters correct and where you can push on the balloon with the least amount of interruption. So it becomes extraordinarily complicated. I also want to say what Senator Looney had indicated, that the House does do their own lines and the Senate does their own lines. We purposely 10 years ago or 9 years ago did not talk to the House about what we were doing because we didn't want that influence. We felt it was important that the Senate drew the lines, not knowing what the House was doing. The House never really wanted to know what we were doing because we felt that that wasn't the influence that should be there. We felt we had the criteria that we had to use to draw our lines to meet the constitutional requirements, and that would be our goal. Independent boards, I think, are a good look when you look at it at some level. But there's another level that you've got to look at it, which is districts have similarities and areas of our state have similarities. There's certain personas that different areas of our state take on. And when we were doing the redistricting and figuring out how to deal with the loss of population and moving these lines around, we try to think about the character of the districts, the folks in the district, whether racial profiling and other, to determine that we keep it somewhat similar in terms of representation about the areas throughout the state. That's a touchy-feely thing, but it's something that analytically you just can't do in the abstract. Our system probably is not perfect. I think we should talk about it more, but our system does, in my view, work. And the reason why I say that is, as Senator Looney pointed out, over the last 4 years, maybe even going back to 6 years, there has been dramatic shifts both in the Senate and in the House. The predictability, one could argue, that you saw or you think you saw 6 or 8 years ago just wasn't there. We have a lot of changes, particularly in the Senate, 12 new seats, 12 new senators out of 36 in the Senate. Some of that are vacancies, no question about it. But even within the vacancies, we had shifts of party affiliations. Seats that were held by Democrats switched Republican. Seats which were held Republican switched to Democrat. I think that speaks to the fact that the system we have, although not perfect, was a fairly drawn system based upon the criteria that we used. So with that, I want to give time to questions. I thank you. Thank you, Women League of Voters. Thank you, Yale Law School, for having us here today, and I look forward to a question. Thank you.
Okay, we're going to have a little Q&A here. Those of you who have questions written on cards, a league representative will pick them up. Just pass it down to the end of the aisle. But before you ask your questions, though, I think the panel should have an opportunity among themselves to ask each other a few questions. So, yes, Dean Gerken.
So this is a question for Tom, and I hear the senators and Secretary Merrill talk about something I think is undoubtedly true, which is that there are hard democratic judgments to be made when you district. So oftentimes when I'm on these panels, one of the first questions is, why not just build a computer program? Make square districts. That would be so easy. I'm just here to tell you that will never work. And it will never work for two reasons. The first is that when you start to draw districts blindly, you can end up disempowering groups without even violating the Voting Rights Act without knowing it, because you're not actually thinking about where voters are clustered. So blind redistricting is actually something that's highly unlikely to satisfy the kinds of democratic concerns that the elected officials here were describing. The other problem is that someone's going to design the system. I have been in on conversations where people say, if we designed a computer program, how can we advantage my side? And so they just bury a lot of the democratic judgments inside the program that are going to advantage one side or disadvantage the other. So Tom, I wonder, I take it that's the hardest challenge for thinking about independent redistricting, is thinking about these democratic choices that have to be made. And I wonder how you think about in answer to what I take to be the response from the elected officials here.
Yeah, well, and also there is this kind of long-running thing going on with the courts when people ask courts to step in, and courts say, well, this is a political thing. And I think that there are two separate questions there. I think redistricting is inherently political in this respect, and I think this is one of the reasons why historically it's been the responsibility of legislators, because redistricting is like a lot of other policy decisions that we ask legislators to make. Like, we don't have time on a daily basis to sort through all of the different things that legislators need to sort through in making decisions. Redistricting is, and so we basically ask legislators to do that balancing for us, and then what they come up with is what we roll with. Redistricting is very similar. There are any number of different ways that you could slice and dice maps. Like, there, as these redistricting applications that generate simulated maps have shown, there are literally millions and billions of different ways to redistrict any given state. The question is whether when you draw those lines, you're actually getting a map that you want that sort of matches your democratic values. My two main takeaways kind of at the highest level are that ideally we want maps that are representative. We want maps that create legislatures that are representative of us, however us is variously defined. And we want maps that create legislators and legislatures that are accountable to us. And that means that if you create maps that make it impossible, basically in the normal course of things, to vote people out of office, then you don't have an accountable map. And if you have a legislature, for instance, like in North Carolina, that's a purple state, but it always sends a 10-3 Republican delegation to Congress, you don't have a representative map either. Those are the kind of two touchstones. Then you want to start working your way through the hierarchies. And so we have these constitutional principles like one person, one vote that basically just say, we've decided that part of the American constitutional order is that everyone's vote counts the same. How do you put that into maps? One person, one vote. You can't have bigger districts than others. We've also decided that racial equity is a key component. So we've created the Voting Rights Act. All of these different things need to be factored in. I don't think, however, that these are decisions that can only be made by legislators, as that is the elected folks who currently serve in our legislatures. The important thing is to have responsible people who seriously think through all of the different value questions that are on the table. Those could be our legislators. They could be other people, but the fact that it's historically been legislators does not mean it cannot be other people from the community, because ultimately all of us are just people from the community. The key is to put the structures in place to make sure that whoever's making these decisions understands what we as the people who are being represented value the most, making it clear what those things are, the order that they should be considered, and then what comes of that comes of that.
Senator Fasano, you had a comment.
Yeah, I'm curious to both the dean and to Tom. If there's certain districts that are created that when you look at the characteristics of that district, it's 80% one party, 20% the other party. Do you believe those districts should be composed to make it a 50-50 split? Or do you think, so in other words, as much as you can, every district should be 50-50? Is that all possible? Is that something that you look at per seat, not, right? What's your feelings on that, either one?
Yeah, I would say I generally do not support competitiveness in the abstract or competitiveness per se. I mean, I think that there are any number of different instances where either as a policy matter or as a legal matter, straight competition probably doesn't produce the best map. I tend to think about maps as at the statewide level and then work our way down. So it may be because, yeah, there are portions of a state that may be predominantly one party or the other, or they may have some other predominant characteristic that's important. If that district is part of an overall map that's functioning the right way, then I have less problems with it.
And I think there's an academic, it's not a consensus. Academics disagree on almost everything. But if you worry about I think most people think the way Tom just described, that it's the most important thing is thinking about a competitive legislature in its entirety. People want to look for competition at the legislative level rather than the district level every time for the simplest reason. So if imagine every district was 50-50, tiny little swings in voter preference would unleash 100% turnover inside the legislature. And then you'd get if you imagine it's a state that's 50-50 and it shifts to 51-49, all those districts end up being 51-49, and you have a legislature that's 100% one party, which is also not reflective. So if you want to think about representation, generally the focus is at competition at the legislative level and fairness at the legislative level, with less worries about what happens district by district.
And the only other thing I would add on that point is that something like the Voting Rights Act, when you create majority minority districts, part of what you're doing there is recognizing the fact that when we leave things purely open to the competitive flow of however people vote, you don't necessarily always produce maps that are treating everyone fairly. And so sometimes it's necessary to create districts that are less competitive because there are other values in play besides just straight competitiveness.
Okay. Any other questions from the panel?
I think that there are probably in Connecticut, I'd say there are probably about maybe 22. I'd say there are about 22 or 23 districts that are probably likely to be won in every election by either by the Democrats or the Republicans. Then there are probably, I'd say, really more than a dozen that really truly are competitive from election to election. So I think that that balance is pretty well reflected in the way that the lines are drawn. The one other thing, Secretary Merrill earlier mentioned, the two significant cases obviously were Baker versus Carr, where the wall of the idea of the political question doctrine was breached. The other one was Reynolds versus Sims, and that was the one where states who were trying to be resistant to the requirements of Baker versus Carr tried to analogize the state situation to that of the U.S. Senate, the U.S. Congress, and said, well, obviously, population districts control the U.S. House of Representatives, but the U.S. Senate is immune from that because there are two from every state, regardless of population. And some tried to argue that, well, only the state houses should be strictly controlled based on population, but state senates should be able to take other factors into account, such as the integrity of lines and affinities and other things. But the the U.S. Supreme Court struck that down in Reynolds versus Sims and said, no, both chambers have to be realigned strictly upon population. And the argument being that state senates cannot be analogized to the U.S. Senate. And that when we're talking about concepts of federalism, it doesn't translate down to something going on within the states, that federalism relates to the relationships between the national government and the state governments, but it can't be cited as a basis for exempting state senates from redistricting. So those two cases together made it necessary to for every 10 years to have the process involve both chambers of both legislatures. Also in Connecticut, another approach was obviously California is known for both creating law and by amending its state constitution in some cases by ballot questions. Some states have initiative, obviously, to create law without legislative action or amend the Constitution without legislative action. Others have referenda, which allows the people to, in effect, second-guess the legislature and by a ballot question repeal an act of the legislature. Some states have one or the other. Some states have both. Connecticut has neither. We don't have the only time there is a ballot question in Connecticut is on a constitutional amendment, not on a citizen initiated question.
Okay. Do the panelists have any other questions to ask each other? Okay. We have a few state legislators here. Would you get up and just tell us your name and district? Yeah. Loudly.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Bobby Gibson. I represent the 15th district, which is Bloomfield and Windsor. And it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Thank you for coming. Anybody else?
I'm Phil Young from the 128th district in Stratford.
Thanks for coming very much. It's great. There are actually two resolutions before the Connecticut General Assembly that would create an independent commission. So this issue is very much before the legislature this session. And there are constitutional amendments as required by the Constitution. We've had a number of questions on an interesting subject, and that is people here are asking the legislators why, with over half the voters in Connecticut being independents, unaffiliated, not R's and not D's, why doesn't the process recognize them? And why doesn't the process recognize some of the third parties that are on the ballot, which include the Working Families Party and the Independent Party? Because right now, as you've pointed out, it's bipartisan between just the two major parties. Can one of you take a crack at that? No.
Bipartisan spirit, Marty passed it to me. So I would say that first, I think that there has been a growing number of independents, and I don't think we've looked at that issue, to be perfectly candid. I mean, let's call them like we see them. I don't think that we've looked at that issue. I think over the last 4 years, we have seen the Independent Party growing. We've seen the Working Families Party growing. You see in certain cities, particularly working families taking council seats. So I think we should look at that perhaps, but I have not given it much thought. I will say that at the Capitol, even if folks who've been elected on Working Families line, in particular, I could think of one or two over the years, they've caucused with, let's say, the Democrats in the case that I'm thinking of. So perhaps the affiliations up at the Capitol have not broken down to a third party other than Republican or Democrat. So maybe that's why it's never really become apparent. There seems to be an affiliation, at least up there, for the only two people, I think, that won on the Working Family line that I can try to think back that I can recall. So it's predominantly still a two-party system with respect to the legislature. Mm-hmm. That would be my guess, but I haven't given a lot of thought, I might say.
Okay.
I agree. I think that is part of the way. We have had a couple of third-party candidates, working family candidates, win in in a couple of urban areas, but for the most part, the rest of the state really is heavily defined by the two parties. And of course, the role of a third party in many cases has been to add votes to somebody who is primarily running on another line. Obviously, we've had Republican candidates who have been helped by being on the independent party line. We've had Democratic candidates who have been helped by being on the Working Families Party line. In fact, Governor Malloy in 2010, the number of votes that he got on the Working Families line were necessary for him to have the victory that he won in that year, which was a very narrow one. But for the most part, the third parties and minor parties have had a role, in effect, having an impact on the fates of the two major parties in elections, rather than having a chance to win on their own. I mean, there are obviously bigger questions for that. I'm sure the dean is an expert on this, and look at basically our system is set up in a way that helps foster the two-party system because of the fact that we have winner-take-all elections and single-member districts without the kind of other varieties that you have in other parliamentary systems. So what often happens in the United States at large is that the minor parties that tend to more closely affiliate with the views of the Republican Party sometimes get subsumed into that party because it's very difficult for them to win seats on their own, and they sometimes get discouraged. And the same thing is true on the left, with the minor and third parties on the left. Seldom win on their own, so they wind up, in effect, casting their lot with the Democrats. Obviously, in systems where you have proportional voting, where you have minor parties sometimes holding significant number of seats in a legislative body, and sometimes controlling the balance of power between the larger parties, as you have in many European parliamentary systems. In those systems, there is an incentive for the minor parties to hold together as separate and distinct parties pushing an agenda, because they actually do have a chance to elect members, and sometimes elect members who will have a significant amount of leverage if the balance between the two larger parties is close. They can sometimes obviously cause a government to collapse and cause a party that is in control to lose a vote of confidence and those kinds of things. But again, that to institutionalize that, we would have to have more of a European parliamentary system than what we have, which is really structured in a way that promotes the two parties.
Secretary Merrill, you have something to add?
Yeah, I just wanted to add something that hasn't been mentioned. The fastest growing group of voters are unaffiliated voters. They are also the voters who vote the least and participate the least. So as Senator Looney just remarked, ours is basically a two-party system. And I know there's always a great deal of unhappiness among unaffiliated voters when they, for example, in Connecticut, cannot participate in the party primaries. So there is increased third-party activity, but not as much as people who are simply not affiliating with parties at all. I'm not sure how you handle that in a redistricting situation, because there is no affiliation there. So there's no group to go to include them, if you will. So, I'm not sure what that portends for the future. And I would also add that the greatest group of unaffiliated voters are all between 18 and 24. Now, whether that is because they're simply too young to have formed a consolidated opinion about which party they would choose, or whether that's just an inclination not to join things, which is perfectly possible, I don't know. And I don't know where that's going, but I would just throw that out there as food for thought.
Okay, thank you. There are a number of questions to the panel relating to computers. The questions are, to what extent are you drawing district lines through the use of computers? And if not, couldn't they be very helpful in creating fair districts that have the kind of standards that Tom Wolfe described?
Sure, I'll go in, but I mean, first is at a high level, I'll echo what Dean Gerken said. Simply putting this in the hands of computers is not the way to go. You're going to end up with a neat grid that has absolutely nothing to do with the way anyone in the state thinks of their interests or how they'd like to vote. what their communities look like, that's bad. Separate and apart from the biases that can get baked into the algorithms. Now, what we can now do is generate billions of maps under any kind of criteria we set. So one thing that these simulated maps can help us figure out is we can come together however we choose to do that, whether it's through legislation that lays out the criteria or a constitutional amendment that changes things. But the idea is that you're specifying what values you value. You ask the computer to draw it to those values and show you a few maps that satisfy all of those values. But it still gets you back to the initial question, which is ultimately you have to balance all of these competing variables, and only humans can do that. That is the truly political aspect of redistricting. When we're talking about political in the nonpartisan way, we're just talking about politics is whenever we all get together to try to solve messy issues that don't have clear answers. And we find the answers through dialoguing with each other and then accepting whatever comes out of that process is kind of like the wisdom of the group.
I should also say that there's a dark side to computer use in redistricting, which is that it makes gerrymanders unbelievably precise. So in the old days, for those of you who've ever gotten out the vote, right, you have the name of a voter. You may know if they voted in the last election, and you may know their party affiliation. That's the old days. Now people know with an unerring precision how you are likely to vote, and they actually don't look at that data nearly as much as they look at things like, what kind of alcohol do you drink? What kind of car do you drive? What kind of searches are you doing on Google? So the political parties now have databases on all of you that is incredibly detailed, that merges information from credit card companies and Facebook and all kinds of other things that allow them to figure out what you're likely to do with enormous precision. Now, if you're a party, you think that's a great thing, right? Because when you go out to vote, you turn out your voters, you don't turn out the other side. It helps you focus your resources. But when you're engaged in redistricting, it means that you can draw lines down to the city block and have enormous confidence that those majorities will be enduring over time. And so the thing that used to happen as voters changed and people made bad guesses is you could see some change in the maps. But nowadays the maps are driven by an enormous amount of precision. And you can actually, I don't know if you've ever done this, but when you sit and draw it, your totals just show up on the right side of the screen, and you can have a really clear sense even of the unaffiliated voters, because even if you don't know whether that person's affiliated with a party, you can have a very good guess as to how they'll vote if they do vote. So computers are a little bit of a double-edged sword in this game.
By the way, this is a very hot audience. You have lots of questions. I'm not sure we're going to be able to cover them all by noon. One of the questions being asked to you, Tom Wolfe, and that is, in the United States, do dollars influence redistricting?
Yes, they do. So I think there was a expose written by David Daly. It's a book a few years ago. Its name I can't quite say in polite company, but it's Rat F Word. But basically what's happened is once people figured out the playbook that Dean Gerken's talking about, how we can manipulate these maps in a very subtle way to generate big advantages for one party over the other, folks realized not just at the state level, but at the national level, that the way we draw the lines matters. And so what we saw this past decade, and this is not just to beat on Republicans, because there's a kind of flip side to this that will be coming up, but in 2010, Republican at the national level launched something called RedMap. And what this process was basically a nationally funded project to go state by state wherever Republicans had control of the redistricting process and squeeze out as many possible seats, both at the state legislative level and at the congressional level. So state politics are now just increasingly part of national politics. And what they'll do is they'll say, look, we want you to draw the maps in a certain way. Here's a consultant. And here's $500,000 to keep these people happy. Here's all the data you need, just draw the maps the way we want them. Now, the playbook is out. In 2010, not everyone knew how to do that. Karl Rove, kind of, I think, when he was feeling very confident, went to the Wall Street Journal, kind of right as the redistricting process was wrapping up, and kind of told everyone what was happening. Now both sides know it. and this is one of the big pitches to the Supreme Court to do something now, is we saw basically 6 congressional maps and basically a dozen state legislative maps this past decade that were what I would call extremely partisan gerrymandered, meaning that one party controlled the process. They used their control to max out the seats that they could get and lock them in so that basically no matter how people voted, the seats wouldn't flip and the party control wouldn't flip. In 2020, I suspect that unless the court says these extreme partisan gerrymanders are unconstitutional, you're going to see more of it from both sides. Any state where either Republicans or Democrats control the entire process, there's going to be money and strategy flowing in to try to max out the maps. The Supreme Court can do a little bit to fix that, but things like commissions and other reforms could also try to take some of that offline.
There's just a logic to this. So there's a Supreme Court case in which a Texas legislator was quoted as saying, "I'd much rather pay a certain amount of money for a consultant than have to raise the money to actually win a competitive district." And that's the inner logic behind this money.
Okay. Senator Looney, this is a question to you. When the state legislature votes on redistricting requiring a 2/3 majority, do the legislators vote separately on the congressional districts and separately on the state legislative districts, or is the 2/3 majority vote taken or leave it for all of them?
See, I'm trying to recall. Do you recall, Lynn, how I think we had one plan that we voted on.
Just glad you got the
Yeah,
question.
yeah. I think, well, it was a 2/3 vote. I don't require whether we had 2 separate resolutions. Do you recall, or was it just one? One vote. That's what I thought, too. It was one vote that constituted the plan for the state house, the plan for the state senate, and the plan for the congressional districts. And obviously, the congressional district plan was the one we did last. And as I said earlier, that was the one that all of the members worked on, rather than just the Senate members working on the Senate plan, the House members. But we came together on that one. But it was all voted as a single resolution that required the 2/3 vote in both chambers.
Okay. And then a related question that's being put is, when the legislature votes on redistricting lines every 10 years, is there actually a public hearing in which the public has a chance to participate?
Oh, yes, there are a number of public hearings. We had public hearings in various parts of the state. Recall we had one in Norwalk. I think we had one in the Hartford area, one in Eastern Connecticut, one in the New Haven area. We were on quite a tour.
Yeah, that's
good.
Yes, people were also asked to send in comments, which we read and we would go over. But we did have a number of public hearings, and we made sure that it was well advertised in the area and covered as many districts as possible.
Okay. The next question is to Senator Looney and/or Senator Fasano, and the question is this: can you assure us that the Connecticut redistricting process is no longer an incumbent protection plan?
Well, I think we addressed that earlier. The fact that election results have been quite volatile in recent years. We have had incumbents of both parties being defeated with greater frequency in the last couple of elections in 2016 and 2018. So I think it really has shown in practice not to be an incumbent protection plan, but it's one that is drawn in a realistic way, driven by the constraints of the Supreme Court requiring us to have very close population balances in each case. Now, the one thing that where we used to have more turnover in elections, and it was something that may or may not have been good because it sometimes meant that candidates were not really elected on their own merits, was when the party lever existed in Connecticut that came to an end after a constitutional amendment passed in 1986. Prior to that time, regardless of however the lines were drawn in redistricting plans, there used to be huge pendulum swings from one election to another. So, for instance, the Nixon landslide of 1972 led to huge Republican majorities in both the House and Senate. 2 years later, in the post-Watergate election of 1974 and Governor Grasso running, there was a huge Democratic sweep. In fact, I believe there were 65 new Democratic members of the State House of Representatives elected that year. So the partisan balance in the House was 118 to 33. after that election Democratic. And the previous 2 years, it had been nearly 100 to slightly more than 50 Republicans. So the Senate was about the same. Same thing happened in the 80s. 84, the Reagan landslide resulted in the state Senate. I believe it was 24-12 Republican after that election. 2 years later, Governor O'Neill running for re-election, popular Democratic governor. State Senate was 25-11 Democratic in 1986. So the changes since the end of the party lever have been generally more moderate. I think this year, since 1992, when I believe there were also a dozen new senators who came in, that was a post-party lever election, but that was the post-income tax vote where we had a large number of retirements that year, just as we had in 2018. But so we have had, I think, significant turnover and swings in Connecticut to indicate that however the lines are drawn has not been really determinative of what election outcomes are likely to be.
I agree with what Senator Looney said, and I also would add, and I think the Secretary of the State would agree, we had a number of close elections in a lot of our races that came down to a bunch of recounts, which speaks to the quality, I think, of the way we did redistricting.
The next question relates to, I guess, what you call prison inmate census issues. And I gather Representative Pat Dillon's got a bill on this. Right now, under the census, prison inmates are counted in the census from the prisons where they're jailed and not from the district from which they came. The question is, do you intend to do anything about this? This would be a question to the two senators.
Well, I would certainly like to. I think that one of the challenges that we have is that, as in many states, our prisons are located in generally fairly lower populated suburban or rural areas of the state. The state pays a substantial amount of money to those towns under the so-called prison pilot, payment in lieu of taxes, to support those prisons. And those towns get the extra benefit of the prisoners being counted for per capita grant purposes to those towns rather than where they actually come from. And since most of our prison population comes from Hartford, New Haven, Bridgeport, Waterbury, New Britain, and a few other communities with large numbers of minority populations, those populations are now, while they're not non-voting populations, certainly in the towns where they're incarcerated, for numerical purposes, they provide a windfall to those communities. Meanwhile, undermining the count of population in the cities in which they come. I would like to see a change in the law that, for purposes of residence, the last town in which the person resided before he went to prison be counted as the town of residence for census purposes.
Senator Fasano, anything?
I would just say I think that's extraordinarily difficult to do. I'm trying to think of how you would actually determine if someone has a lease, is that considered residence? If they're only there for 3 months when they get arrested, do you consider that their domicile? Whether or not they live with a relative, then own home. I mean, there's so many complicated factors, and I would think that that would cost an awful lot of money just to figure out what the real domicile is and how that all works out, whether it is a domicile or whether it was a residency. So I'd look into it more, but I just don't know whether or not there's an assuredness that could go with that calculation.
Next, one member of our audience believes that the 1st Congressional District in Connecticut is geographically strung out and not contiguous. Anyone have a comment on that? Congressman Jim Hines' district.
Well,
I'm sorry. Larson.
Yeah, it is
Congressman
Congressman Larson. Well, first of all, under Connecticut law, it must be contiguous in the strict meaning of the word, meaning that all towns touch each other in that district. And it is, yes, it is contiguous. So, but not to say that it's not a very odd shape, shall we say. And so, that was part of the plan. I know that factored in, and I don't know a lot about this, but it factored in when we lost a congressional seat. And there was an attempt to balance the two districts, I believe. The 5th, because the 5th and the 6th had to collapse, that factored somehow into that decision. And I wasn't there at the time, and I don't remember why exactly it ended up looking like that. But I believe it was an attempt to balance some of the many things we're talking about here. Both town lines, competitiveness, all these factors we've been talking about. So
one thing in that also, the one person, one vote rule of the 60s made it impossible to pursue the resolution or bypass this difficult question regarding congressional redistricting. In the 1930s, Connecticut went from 5 congressional districts to 6, but bypassed the touchy issue of how all those districts were going to be reconfigured by just creating an overlay, an at-large district that existed until the 60s. And of course, that had to be, in the 60s, all the districts then had to be drawn into 6. But from the 30s to the 60s, there was an at-large member of Congress. So we had 5 congressional districts based on population, 1 at-large district. And I remember as a kid watching the news with my father, and I was learning vocabulary, and I learned the word at large in the context of an escaped prisoner being at large. And then on the news, there was always discussion about Congressman at large Frank Kowalski. And I remember asking my father, Dad, what did Kowalski do that he's at large and on the run and that the police are after him? But that all came to an end in the 60s when the 6 actual districts had to be created, and that dropped to 5 then in 2001.
Okay. Dean Gerken, this is a question to you as follows. You mentioned your scholarship in federalism, and Secretary Merrill alluded to the Connecticut Constitution, which lays out the redistricting process. The question is, how many other states frame their redistricting process within their state constitutions?
That's actually a great question. I don't know off the top of my head, but a fair number. Typically, the United States Constitution is a very strange constitution because it's so small and it has so few words in it and has so little guidance in it, which is why we're constantly in court talking about it. State constitutions tend to be, for some states, the vehicle for doing things like this. And so my guess is it's a fairly large number, but I actually haven't sat down and counted.
Okay. Secretary Merrill?
Yeah, there probably are quite a number that do it, especially in New England. We tend to be the ones that have the more extensive constitutions. I know that because this might be the moment to mention how this would actually have to occur to make a change in our state constitution, which is what would be required if we were to go to change any of this, because it is spelled out, and I think I read from it here somewhere. There are factors in our state constitution, and it does lay out the entire process I talked at the beginning, how many committee members from each party. So to change that, as I know, because I have a constitutional amendment to get Connecticut some early voting in the state right now, thank you. What you need to do is pass a constitutional amendment. To do that, you need to have either let's put it this way, at least 50% needed in both houses of the General Assembly, no signature from the governor needed, to get it on the ballot. If it passes by more than that, by 75% of both houses, it goes on the ballot in the next statewide election, which would be 2020, if something passed this year. Then, of course, everyone gets to vote, and then we would then have to put in place procedures to accomplish whatever it was the voters decided, and that wouldn't happen until 2021. If you only get between 50% and 75% of the vote, it has to go back to another General Assembly. In other words, if something were to pass this year, it would go to the 2020 General Assembly, another group, so not even just next year. And that group would have to pass it by at least 50%. And then it would go on the ballot in 2022. So this is a long process, just to make you aware of that.
Okay.
It sounds like on the basis of that one, that even if it started today, wouldn't affect maps until 2030. And if I could throw in one plug for work my colleagues at the center have done, they released last year something called the 50-State Guide to Redistricting, which lays out these kind of like bigger factual questions about what controls what aspect of the process in each state.
Okay, we're going to close this now, and I really want some warm applause for these great panelists. They're great. We haven't gotten to many of your questions. They may stay around here a while. You can talk to them. I got to also recognize Elise Lowe. She's right here. Elise Lowe is the president of the East Shoreline chapter of the League. She's done so much for this event today. So let's give her a round of applause. Okay, and then I remind you that there are, as I mentioned before, resolutions to have a independent district commission in Connecticut. One is House 16, and the other is House 58, as I read here. Sponsored by Representative Fred Camillo, Representative Caroline Simmons, Representative Josh Elliott, and Representative David Michel. So that is something for you to think about. Stay tuned, and thanks for coming, and back to you, Carol.
Hey, thank you to Ed Meyer, who moderated. And just quickly, I wanted to say I was proud to remember that many of the election reforms that have happened over the years have been strongly supported, and the League has been very active on, particularly the removal of the party lever from our voting. With that in thought, I also want to again repeat thank you for a lively and very thought-provoking morning discussion about redistricting. These kind of forums are very important to our organization. The League of Women Voters cares about citizens learning and having the knowledge about their government that they need to have to participate and be active people in their democracy. And so I will just end with our mission statement, which is that we work to empower voters and defend democracy. And anyone in this room, if you're not already a member of the League, we welcome you. There's brochures if you'd like to join us. There's more power with more hands working on it. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Carol.
I wanted to just read briefly a couple of the things that the way commissions have been adapted. So in a few states that have commissions with primary responsibility for drawing a plan, one commissioner from each legislative leaders pool and 2 commissioners from the pool of unaffiliated applicants selected earlier. Geographic distribution based on congressional districts and a final selection of 4 commissioners from each of the 2 largest parties and 4 unaffiliated commissioners is required. After that, they look into the entrails of birds that used to be done in during Roman times to try to determine victory. Same thing, the Michigan Commission, if you can follow.